Where's the taxes?
Right on the top line, 38.
Yes, 38.
Oh, 38,
39.
39.
Camera's on.
Chair.
Okay.
Yeah, are we ready?
Yes.
Actual. All of a sudden I'm off. Testing. Are you on?
Yeah.
Now, we gotta reboot the computer.
Oh, man, sorry. That was me hitting the switch.
Do we have the PowerPoint here as well?
We do. Post-lecture.
Okay, the actual passage begins in chapter 38, verse 1 and continues to chapter 39, verse 16. Verse 17 begins a brand new context not related to the Gog and Magog situation. The way we're going to deal with the topic is, first of all, under Roman numeral 1, we'll go with a verse-by-verse exposition of these verses, and then under Roman 2, we'll discuss how can we determine the timing of this invasion, or whereupon it may happen in God's prophetic timetable.
It's gonna take a while, because the computer was shut off in the middle. It's gotta go through its whole,
Okay.
reboot cycle. We're 15%. It's 18, 20.
So let's go ahead and start, or do we need to wait for the picture to come up?
The PowerPoint won't come up until the computer does, so we won't have PowerPoint yet.
Yeah, you now look at me,
It'll take a
Ted?
few minutes still.
You don't know, okay.
Questions?
All right, let's turn to chapter 38, and we'll go with the text, and it'll catch up with us eventually. But calculate the alliance in chapter 38, verses 1 through 6. And in verse 1, the word of God comes to the prophet with a brand new revelation. And in verse 2, we're told about the leadership of this confederacy. In leadership, in verse 2, Son of man, set your face towards Gog, or the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So verse 2, leadership of the confederacy happens to be a person by the title of Gog. Now Gog is not an individual personal name. Gog is a title, and the title of the prince or the leader of the land of Magog. It's the same as Pharaoh. Pharaoh was not a name. Pharaoh was simply the title of the leader of Egypt. There are many various names among the pharaohs, such as Thutmose and Amenhotep and others. But the Pharaoh was merely a title of whoever happens to be the leader of Egypt. Same thing with the word Kaiser. Kaiser was the title of whoever was the king of Germany. Tsar was not a name, was the title of the king of Russia. For the same token, Gog is not a name. It's a title of the future leader or king of Magog. And Magog was the territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So in that, what is now southern Russia, it was in this landmass from the Black Sea on the west side and the Caspian Sea on the east side. And that's where Magog was located. And Gog is merely the shorter form for the land of Magog. And it's the title of the leader of Magog. Now, as far as the origin of the land of Magog, Magog first appears in the list of names in the book of Genesis chapter 10. He was the son of Japheth in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2, and he settled in the territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which today again is southern Russia. He's referred to as the Prince of, and besides being the leader of southern Russia or Magog of that period, he's also the ruler of 3 other territories, Rosh. Rosh was what is now northern Russia, and that's the root for the word Russia, by the way. Secondly, Meshach was the son of Japheth in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2. Other references to him are found elsewhere in the book of Ezekiel. And he's the one that gave rise to the name of Moscow. Meshach became Moscow. And then the third territory was Tubal. Tubal was also a son of Japheth in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2. And it gave rise to the city named as Tobolsk. And Tobolsk was the key city in Siberia. By the way, Tobolsk was also where I was born. Initially I thought it was good to see the name of my birthplace listed in the Bible, but as I kept on reading, I wasn't so happy about it. But we shall see as the time progresses. So he was the leader of Magog, southern Russia, also controlled northern Russia, also into Siberia. And now then at the end of the verse, prophesy against him. And so it's like setting one's face against him in the Hebrew text. And so the 4 territories named all together are all part of the former Soviet Union. And now it's referred to as the Commonwealth of Independent States. And covers both northern and southern Russia, and certain parts of certain parts of European Russia, also the Asian part of Russia, which would be Siberia, where Tobolsk is located. Now, in ancient rabbinic references that affirms all these things we just talked about, and so quoting some of the rabbis in the Orthodox commentary, Gog and Magog are hostile armies against Israel before the coming of Mashiach ben David, meaning Messiah, the son of David. And so this Gog and Magog war will precede the coming of the Messiah, the son of David. Now, in the rabbinic theology about messianism, they're not able to correlate how some prophecies can be speaking of a time of a suffering Messiah, followed by the time of a conquered Messiah. So they came up with a view that there be 2 different Messiahs. The first Messiah was called Messiah, son of David. And so Messiah, son of David, will be fighting the Gog and Magog war, not the son of David, but son of Joseph. Messiah, the son of Joseph, will be fighting the Gog and Magog war. He'll be killed in the Gog and Magog war. Then will come another Messiah, Messiah, son of David, that will win the war and raise the first Messiah back to life. And this is rabbinic theology. It's not biblical truth. But it connects all of this as we have just connected it with the territory of what is now the Commonwealth of Nations, part of Russia. And one of the commentaries reads, the Geonim were lead rabbis of the Middle Ages, had a tradition that these countries were indeed located in Russia. Another commentary reads as follows: oral tradition passed down from the Vilna Gaon, who was the leading rabbi of the city of Vilna. When the Russian Navy passes through the Bosporus, that is on the way to the Dardanelles, it will be time to put on Sabbath clothes in anticipation of the coming of the Messiah. And so rabbis connected the Gog and Magog was described here specifically with Russia, and also with the fact that the 2 messiahs would be involved in this situation. Now turning to verses 3 and 4 of chapter 38, in verse 3 there is a declaration of divine opposition. Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. And in verse 4, he deals with the preparation of this invasion. I will turn you about. He was intending to attack in one direction, but he'll be diverted away from his planned attack. I will put hooks into your jaws He was facing north, so now he'll be turned around to be facing south. And I'll bring you forth. God is bringing this invasion about with all your army, horses, horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great company with buckler, with shield, all of them handling swords. So he gathers a great army, and the intent was to attack towards the north. But God will now turn him around and decide to attack to the south, specifically against Israel. He won't do it alone, because in verses 5 and 6 he mentions some other allies. For example, Persia. Persia was the son of Japheth. Modern-day Iran is ancient Persia. Then you have Cush. Cush was the son of Ham in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. And Cush is the territory of what is now Ethiopia. Put is also the son of Ham in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. And Put became Somalia or Somaliland, initially Somaliland, today Somalia. And then he mentions Gomer, also son of Japheth in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2. And in the Jewish Talmud, it is spelled as Germania, which is the Hebrew word for Germany. But in the Talmud, it's Germania, or Germany. And all his hordes, numerous people, numerous men in the army. And he mentions the house of Togarmah. Togarmah was the grandson of Japheth through Gomer in Genesis chapter 10, verse 3. And he represents Armenia and certain sections of Turkey. A section of Turkey is actually in Europe, and that will be part of this identification of Togarmah. The rest of Turkey is part of Asia. All his hordes, again, numerous men in this army. And notice the phrase, in the uttermost parts of the north. In this verse, this is specifically identifying it with Togarmah. But chapter 38, verse 15, later in chapter 39, verse 2, the whole invading army also comes from the uppermost parts of the north. If you draw on a map, a line from Moscow to Jerusalem, it'll be almost a straight north-south line. Straight north-south line. So from Israel, the utmost parts of the north would be Russia, and Moscow is directly north from Jerusalem. Even many peoples with you. It may refer to the number of people already mentioned. It may refer to other nations not mentioned, but it really is going to be an amazingly huge army. Now, some observations. Of these nations mentioned, 6 are nations that are Japhethite, meaning from Japheth, one of the sons of Noah, and 2 are Hamitic nations, also a son of Noah. No Semitic nation is listed. There's not a single Arab state who's part of this invasion. And the Jewish people came from Shem. It would not be kosher to come from Ham. Think on it, you'll get it. Now again, the rabbinic commentary that goes back to ancient literature of the Jewish people reads as follows. The Yerushalmi Megillah, which is part of the ancient writings, renders Magog as Gudya, and the Goths, a group of nomadic tribes who destroyed the Scythians and made their home in Scythian territory. Considering that Goths were a Germanic people, the identification of Magog descendants as in accord with Targum Yonatan to Genesis chapter 10, verse 2, which renders it as being Magog and Germania, using both the name here and the Hebrew name for Germany. And so these are the connections that the rabbis made. They may not be correct as far as what they describe, but they base the passage on rabbinic tradition. And we're going to notify that what the text says is correct as far as the Bible is concerned. We're not sure how correct the rabbis may be, but they clearly identify it as we just did with Russia and certain other nations. Now we come to verses 7 through 9, capital B in your outline, the object of the invasion. In verse 7, the preparation. Be you prepared, yet prepare yourself, you, that's emphatic, you prepare yourself, and all your companies. And there's a play upon words in the Hebrew text. And they are assembled unto you, another play upon words in the Hebrew text. Be on guard unto them. Be on guard. Be a protector. Be their security, to take command. And so now God is taking full command of all of these nations and their armies to serve as their security and for the whole army, and to look over the well-being of the soldiers now working under him. Now the object of the invasion is in verse 8. The timing, after many days you shall be visited. In the latter years, this will occur during the times of the last days, during the prophetic future, and the object is you shall come into the land that's brought back from the sword, that's gathered out of many peoples, upon the mountains of Israel, which have been a continuous waste, is brought forth out of the peoples, they shall dwell securely, all of them. The Bible speaks of two different worldwide regatherings of the Jewish people. The first worldwide regathering is in unbelief, in preparation for judgment, and the judgment will be in the Great Tribulation. But then will come a second worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessing, the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. And so what's been described in verse 8 is the first worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. And this is the timing of the specific invasion sometime after Israel became a state in 1948. And verse 9 then deals with the massiveness of this invasion. You shall ascend. He draws several similes to show his massiveness. You shall come like a storm. You shall be like a cloud to cover the land. And those involved, you, meaning Gog and Magog, all your hordes, the nations which he is over the prince over, and many peoples with you, numerous allies that he has backing him. Now to make some observations so far. This prophecy presupposes that Israel is back in the land, and it is now back in the land, has been back in the land as a state since 1948. And this return is the return in unbelief, because Israel will be saved only sometime after this invasion. And this return in unbelief is already mentioned by Ezekiel in chapter 38, verses 24 through 27, chapter 38, verses 24 through 27, and also in chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. 37, 1 through 14, the vision of the dry bones. And the restoration in unbelief, notice, is described in four specific ways. First, a land brought back from the sword. Jewish people had to gain the land by means of a war, the War of Independence, especially, and then followed by the Six-Day War. Secondly, a land is gathered out of many peoples. The Jews living in Israel today have come from 90 different countries around the world. 90. Third, a land with mountains that have been a continual waste. For 2,000 years now, these mountains, the central mountain range of Israel, have been a continuous waste. And then fourthly, a land that is brought forth out of the peoples, brought forth by Jewish people that have migrated back to the land from different parts of the world. And waste places, all these statements he's made so far describe Israel as she exists today. And the waste places have been built, resettled, and so on. In verses 10 through 12, capital C, we deal with the purpose of the invasion, and the planning of God in verse 10 is, it shall come to pass in that day, meaning the day and the time of the invasion, that things shall come into your mind. You shall devise an evil device. And this invasion is clearly premeditated and carefully planned out. And the plan is spelled out in verse 11. I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them, meaning the Jews, that are at rest, that dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. Now what you find as far as describing the state, you see the word security mentioned several times in this passage, but the word peace, the word shalom, is not mentioned even once. And one of the misconceptions about the timing of this invasion is that it comes at a time when Israel is living in peace. But the word peace is not there, not even once. But they're living in security. And it's a word that means that they are well rested in their own military and so on. So they feel quite safe in the land that they live. Now the purpose of Gog's invasion is found in verse 12. And the purpose is, number one, to take the spoil. You cannot do this in English because these are not play upon words by using the two same Hebrew roots. So in Hebrew reads the shlol shalel. The shlol shalel meaning to spoil the spoil. To take the prey is also a word playing labaz, baz, labaz, baz, or base. That means to prey the prey. To prey, P-R-E-Y, to prey the prey. And in English this comes out to take the prey. But then if you look at the Hebrew text, it's actually a word play in both cases. To turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, against the people that are gathered out of the nations, that are gotten cattle, referring to livestock, goods, material wealth, that dwell in the middle of the earth. So some observations on this passage. The key element and the key goal, the key purpose is spoil. Now the text is silent about the content of the spoil. Phrases like cattle and goods, silver and gold are all general terms for spoils of war. And people have resorted to different kinds of guesses as to what the spoil might be. The text does not tell us. And when we study the Bible and teach the Bible, we should teach it for everything it does say. Once the text stops, we need to stop. Not apply guessing work, not apply speculation. That's given prophecy a bad name over the years. But the key purpose is spoil. And it's all for Gog's, not God's, but Gog's self-interest. Now in verse 13, we do read of some nations protesting this invasion. And the protesters are, first of all, Sheba. He was the grandson of Abraham to Abraham's third wife named Keturah in Genesis chapter 25, verse 3. Genesis 25, verse 3. And Sheba now is in the area of Saudi Arabia. Then the city of Dedan, or land of Dedan, he was a grandson of Abraham through Keturah in Genesis chapter 25, verse 3. And he also resides in the area of Saudi Arabia. The merchants of Tarshish. Tarshish was names of colonies that were established by the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians in modern-day Lebanon. And there are three different Tarshishes that might be possible. One was on the east coast of Africa. This is not likely. A second one is England. This is the one more popular prophecy teachers, especially American prophecy teachers, like to identify, because if this Tarshish is England, then that's how they include the United States and Canada, Great Britain, and other nations of that nature as being the Tarshish in this passage. However, the primary place was not England, but Spain. And other places where Tarshish is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, it's always Spain, which therefore Spain would include the Spanish-speaking world of both in Central America and South America, with the exception of Brazil, which came from Portugal. And so what we're keeping it with the context here and elsewhere in the book of Ezekiel, besides those two nations of Saudi Arabia, there'll be other nations that will be listed as descendants from Spain, and that would be Central and South America. And you have the phrase, and all the young lions thereof. That's a phrase, an idiom nations which come out of Tarshish. So these are the Spanish-speaking nations of Central and South America that came out from the Spanish Tarshish. And so the only country exception would be Brazil. And so Spain in particular and the nations of Central and South America, with the exception of Brazil, are going to be protesting this invasion. And he says, they shall say to you, are you come to take the spoil? Again, the wordplay in Hebrew, lish'ol shalal, to spoil the spoil. Have you assembled your company to take the prey? Again, to prey the prey, to carry away the prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take away spoil, and that's the real aim. So some observations here. Semitic nations will not be in favor of this Russian invasion. There are some Muslim countries, but not Semitic Muslim countries. No Muslim country, no Semitic Muslim country participates in the invasion, nor will favor it. They'll oppose it. And the protesters recognize that Russia is invading for her own self-interest and not for the benefit of the Arab population. But they will protest, but they will not go beyond the protest stage. So we come to the next section, verses 14 to 16, the invasion itself. It begins with God's challenge in verse 14. And you, son of man, prophesy, say unto Gog, and it introduces now a new section. In the day when my people Israel dwells securely, shall you not know it? Notice dwelling securely, but not dwelling in peace. Gog has studied the Israeli situation very carefully. Now he feels Israel is ripe for invasion. And so verse 15, he describes the departure from the north. You shall come from your place of the outermost parts of the north. It's not limited to Togarmah, but includes all of the specific Russian elements that go to the very extreme north. Many peoples with you, these are the allies that have joined themselves with it. All of them riding upon horses, a great company, a mighty army. Now, is it going to be an invasion by use of horses and so on, or because there were no Hebrew words for monetary warfare that Ezekiel can use in the ancient Hebrew? It could be, on one hand, he's merely using the ways wars were fought in his day, but the reality will be weapons of war of our modern day. That's one option. Or the other option, things may change radically over the years so that they may have to resort to older methods of warfare. Could be one or the other. We'll have to wait and see, and when these things finally occur, to know which way it's going to go. It could go one way or the other. And in verse 16, it describes the arrival into Israel. You shall come against my people Israel, and that was the object of the invasion. My people, Israel, is still the people of God. As a cloud to cover the land, that describes the massiveness of the invasion, causing like a cloud shading a large area. By the same token, the armies with the masses of people will cover much of the land that they cover. And the timing is, it shall come to pass in the latter days, in the prophetic future time, I will bring you against my land, God's land. So God is the one who's bringing this invasion about into his own land, the same land he gave to the Jewish people. And God's purpose as to why he allows this to happen is that the nations may know me, the Gentile nations may realize who is God indeed. And the means by which this will happen, when I shall be sanctified in you, O God, before their eyes, and God was set apart by what he shall do to Gog. A couple of observations here. There is initial success by the invaders. They do penetrate the Israeli military guarding the borders, and they enter into the center part of the country. And while God has his purpose to take the spoil, God has his own purpose, and that is to be sanctified among the Gentile nations. They'll now observe what God will do. So we come to chapter 38, verses 17 to 23, the destruction of the invaders. It begins in verse 17 with a declaration and accusation. Are you he of whom I spoke in the old times by my servants, the prophets of Israel? Now the question then is, which prophets have spoken of this invasion? He says that prophesied in those days for many years that I would bring you against them. Now, among the writing prophecies, the written prophets that we have in the scriptures, they never mention any Magog section. Magog is not mentioned at all. So it's not found among the writing prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah and so on. And therefore probably applies to the vocal prophets who gave prophecies verbally but never wrote anything down, like the prophet Nathan, for example, and so on. So it was not found among the writing prophets, which is referring to something that was known by the spoken prophets who wrote nothing down. But somehow it was known of what they prophesied, and that is what he's referring to in verse 17. That Ezekiel is the first one to put this in written form. Others prophets spoke of this before he did. In the verse 18, the first part of verse 19, you have the basis of the judgment. It shall come to pass in that day. What day? In the day of the invasion, when God shall come against the land of Israel, against God's land, so they're anti-Israel, and against God's people, so they're also anti-Semitic. And they will not suffer the wrath of God, that my wrath shall come up into my nostrils, for in my jealousy, in the fire of my wrath, have I spoken. The invasion against God's people and the land will cause God to move for two reasons. Number one, God's jealousy. The right of protection. We tend to see the word jealousy always negative. Sometimes it is negative, but sometimes it is positive. And the positive use of jealousy is the right of protection and exercise of ownership. The right of protecting something you own and exercise of ownership. And what God is now doing is violating the wife of Yahweh, the wife of Jehovah, because Israel is described as the wife of Jehovah in many passages. And that's one topic we'll deal with later on in the week. So first of all, God's jealousy, but also God's wrath. And the God's wrath will now destroy the invader. And this is the cursing facet of the Abrahamic covenant. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, Genesis 12:3, God said, I will bless them that bless you, but him that curses you will I curse. And now God is going to suffer the cursing facet of the Abrahamic covenant. And what will be the means of destruction? In the second part of verse 19 to verse 22, he mentions a number of supernatural events. Some are natural, some are supernatural, that bring about a total destruction of the invading army. First of all, an earthquake in the second part of verse 19 and verse 20. And there'll be a great shaking in verse 19. Surely in that day, at the time of the invasion, that there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. And the result is in verse 20. Upon life they shall shake in my presence. What life? The fishes of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that creep upon the earth. And these are all of the different facets of the animal kingdom will feel the effects of this unique supernatural earthquake. And furthermore, all men are upon the face of the earth. Better in translation, it should be the word land. All the men upon the face of the land, because the land in particular will be shaken. And so upon the land the mountains shall be thrown down, the steep places shall fall, every wall shall fall to the ground. That's the Hebrew word for the walls of housing and so on, but this is the Hebrew word for walls that surround the city. And in modern day Israel, there are two such cities. Jerusalem, the old city, is surrounded by a wall, and so is the city of Akko, or Acre, further north, is surrounded by a wall, and these are the walls that will be shaken down when this earthquake hits. But it won't be the walls, the city walls, but about the surrounding walls. In verse 21, there'll be mutual killing. I will call for a sword against them unto all my mountain. The sword means killing by war. My mountains is the place where Gog and his armies will be destroyed. And the means, every man's sword shall be against his brother. There'll be different ethnic identities in these combination of armies, and the different nationalities will start fighting among themselves. Similar to what happened back in Judges 7, verse 22, Judges 7:22, also in 1 Samuel 14, verse 20, 1 Samuel 14:20, and 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 23. And other means, besides these major ones, is in verse 22. I will enter into judgment with him, with Gog, with pestilence, meaning plagues, with blood, with a flood. He says, I'll rain an overflowing shower. And the objects of this shower, this flood, will be upon him, upon his hordes, and upon many peoples that are with him. And so many are going to be killed by means of a massive flood against these armies. And the accompanying elements with the massive amount of rain would include hailstones and fire and brimstones. Now, because of usage of these terms, hailstones, fire, and brimstones, but you find many prophecy teachers who like to use what are called newspaper exegesis and tries to explain this by merely somewhat natural needs, claim that this is describing a nuclear warfare. And they're going to say the United States will probably drop some nuclear weapons upon the invading army. Now, these same elements are described as what destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, 4 of the 5 cities of the days of Abraham and Lot. Now, if these people who say this is a nuclear war, especially by the USA against the Russians, if this is a nuclear war, I want to know who dropped the bombs upon Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim. Did anybody drop any nuclear bombs on those cities? No, there were divine judgments directly upon those cities. And this should be taken the very same way. This is not something the US or even Israel will be able to accomplish. This will be God will accomplish this massive destruction by a supernatural means. And that's why the world will be impressed by the nature of it. And in verse 23, in this way God fulfills his divine purpose. The purpose, I will magnify myself, I will sanctify myself, I will make myself known in the eyes of many nations, the Gentile nations. And the result is, they shall know I am Yahweh, they shall know I am Jehovah. So, again, some observations. But number one, God himself totally destroys the invaders by both natural and supernatural means. Some are natural, and some are supernatural. Secondly, no other nation, not even Israel or the USA, will be used by God to destroy the invaders. God will do so himself directly. And so thirdly, in this way, God will indeed get the glory. And so now we come to chapter 39, verses 1 through 16, the overthrow of Gog. And verses 1 through 8 provide a summary of the invasion and the destruction of the invaders. And in verse 1, there is again the addressee, and you, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, thus says the Lord Jehovah. What's happening in verses 1 through 8 is what we call the law of recurrence. Law of recurrence is where you have a description of chronological events, and then you have a second passage right next to it It goes back to the earlier part of the first passage to provide some more details. The Bible begins with this. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3. Genesis 1:1 to chapter 2, verse 3, what you have is the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. And you have a chronological sequence of what God did on each day. Now what happens in chapter 2, verses 4 through the end of the chapter, verse 25, it follows the law of recurrence. It goes back to an earlier part of the first passage. It goes back to the 6th day to give us more details how Adam was created, how Eve was created. So in the 6th day, chapter 1, God simply created man and woman, with almost no details. But now in chapter 2, following the recurrence, it goes back to earlier part of chapter 1 to show the details of how Adam was created, how Eve was created, and so on. That's a common element you find throughout the scriptures. Another example is Genesis chapters 10 and 11. In chapter 10, we read about all the nations who descended from the 3 sons of Noah. And as you look at the list, he mentions so many nations from this one, some nations from this one, and they were scattered, and they assembled, and they were divided by means of different things, one of which was languages, by their tongues. Well, when they're on Noah's Ark, they all spoke the same language. And the first language, for reasons I won't get into, would have been the Hebrew language. But they all spoke the Hebrew language. So how come all of a sudden they're speaking all these different languages in different countries? That's when you come to chapter 11. It follows the law of recurrence. In chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, he goes back to the earlier section of chapter 10 and describes how the languages came into being, God's judgment upon the Tower of Babel, and so on. This is what's happening here, because by the end of chapter 38, the whole army has been destroyed. In chapter 39, they're living again. Did God raise them back to life all of a sudden? No, it goes back to the second of chapter 38 to provide us with some more details. So continuing, behold, I am against you, Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. And in verse 2, I will turn you about from a planned attack. And the planned attack was somewhere towards the north. And I will lead you. And the Hebrew word means to proceed, to climb, to lead, or to seduce. Now, if you're reading the Old King James Version, it says, I will leave but a sixth part of you. That's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew word. And only King James has it, all the other translations have it correctly. But the entire army is destroyed. It doesn't say, I will leave but a sixth part of you. That it has been totally destroyed in chapter 38. But rather simply means that you'll be totally annihilated. I will cause, it says, he didn't leave any one invading soldier to be part of the force. I will cause you to come up in the most parts of the north. That was the source of the invasion. I'll bring you upon the mountains of Israel. Now the focus will be more upon the central mountain range. And the invaders will enter the central mountain range. That will be the actual place of their total destruction. And the mountains of Israel were not in Israel in 1948. And the land was divided at the end of the War of Independence. There was a line drawn, and Israel received only about 5% of the mountains. The border between Israel and Jordan ran at the foot of these mountains. It cut in to cut Jerusalem in two, and back out again and around the mountains. Israel only had 5% of the mountains. 95% was under Jordanian control for 19 years, and that included the city of Jerusalem. And then one of the byproducts of the Six-Day War is that's when the West Bank fell under Israeli sovereignty. Only then was it even possible to rebuild the temple. It was not possible from 1948 to 1967. Only after 67 was there a possibility. So verses 3 and 5, he then deals with the destruction of the invading army. He points out there's a total failure in all of their weaponry. In verse 3, I will smite your bow out of your left hand. I will cause your arrows to fall out of your right hand. In verse 4, there'll be a total fall of the armies. The place you shall fall upon the mountains of Israel. And again, the central mountain range. It begins at the south end of the Galilee, at the south end of the Jezreel Valley. It runs the whole length of the country and peters out just north of Beersheba. And in these mountains are many of the biblical cities like Shechem, like Samaria, Jerusalem, Bethel, Ai, and Hebron, Bethlehem, and others. And again, until 67, Israel only had 5% of those mountains, but now they had all of them. And that's also what the enemy will be destroyed. The fact that they entered the central mountain range shows that they were heading for the city of Jerusalem. And so he declares in verse 5, you shall fall upon the open fields. That will be the grand finale. For I have spoken it, says the Lord Jehovah, and that was the guarantee. This also shows why it could not be merely a nuclear warfare. As, keep in mind, how wide is Israel? Only about 50 miles wide. So if you drop a nuclear bomb in the middle of the country, it'll destroy everything. But here, only the enemy is destroyed. We should keep that in mind. As far as I know, they've not yet been able to invent a nuclear bomb and inscribe on it for Gentiles only. No such nuclear weapon exists and will never exist. And so in verse 6, we have the destruction of the land of Magog. Not only will God bring about a judgment upon the invading army, he'll bring upon a judgment upon the land of Magog, the territory of southern Russia between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. I will send fire on Magog. As soon as the armies are destroyed in Israel, the country of origin itself will suffer the consequences. And on them that dwell securely in the isles, even the islands of the coast of the countries from where the invaders came, will also suffer a destructive judgment. And they shall know something. They shall know I am Jehovah. And the invaders will recognize who is God indeed. In verse 7, there'll be the sanctification of God's name. Among the Jews, for example, my holy name will I make known in the midst of my people Israel. This is stronger than merely saying they will know I am Jehovah. He will be made known to them in this very special way. This is salvation knowledge. Destruction invaders will cause a revival in Israel, and my people Israel now become the people of God, not merely covenantally, but also spiritually. Neither will I suffer my holy name to be profaned anymore. This was a common problem in the past, as Ezekiel describes in chapter 20 and again in chapter 36. But now they'll be more firm in what they believe. And ultimately, they'll come to a national salvation. Among the Gentiles, the nations shall know that I am Jehovah. They will learn who is God indeed, the Holy One of Israel, and they will learn that Jehovah is Israel's unique God. And then verse 8 gives us the declaration of certainty. Behold, it comes. The time for the prophecy to be fulfilled will eventually come to pass. It shall be done. The promises will be fulfilled. This is the day whereof I have spoken. And then comes two elements that helps determine about the timing of this invasion. In verses 9 and 10, he mentions the 7 years of burning all of the equipment of war. The burning is in verse 9. The burners, they that dwell in the cities of Israel shall go forth, shall make fires of the weapons and burn them, shields, bucklers, bows, arrows, handstaves, which are usually used for driving animals, but here they were used for weapons, and spears. And the duration of getting rid of all of this military equipment, it provides them energy, provides them with fires. for 7 years Lent. And so that will be the provision of fuel in the first part of verse 10, so that, because of verse 9, they shall take no wood out of the field, neither cut down any of the trees of the forest, for they shall make fires out of the weapons. Exactly how this will be accomplished, only time will tell. And the second part of verse 10, we see again the principle of the Abrahamic covenant, curse for curse in kind. What that means is the way anyone curses the Jews, that same curse will fall upon the one doing the cursing. And that's what the point of the second part of verse 10 is. They shall plunder those that plundered them. They shall spoil the spoilers. They shall rob them, those that rob them. They shall pray the prayers. The last section is the 7 months of burial in verses 11 to 16. In that day, the day of Gog's destruction, I will give unto Gog a place for burial in Israel. The country they sought to take over is the country they'll end up to be buried in. They'll become the graveyard. The location, the valley of them that passed through, on the east of the sea. East of the sea would be east of the Dead Sea. The Jordan Valley above the Dead Sea, so north of the Dead Sea, there'll be a large area in order to be able to bury all of the multitude. It shall stop them to pass through it, and there shall they bury Gog and his multitude. And then there'll be a new name, will be called the Valley of Hamon Gog. Hamon means multitude. The cemetery will be the multitude of Gog. And in verse 12, the duration of the burial will take 7 months. 7 months shall the house of Israel be burying them, purpose that they might cleanse the land. Because in the book of Numbers chapter 35, verses 33 and 34, Numbers 35, verses 33 and 34, when there's a dead body on any ground, that ground is unclean until the body is buried. The purpose of cleansing the land from all of this mass burial, they'll be buried in masses initially, but then for individual bodies here and there not so easily found, then they'll have to do some other elements which this passage describes. So verse 13, yea, all the people of the land shall bury them. The Jews will do the burying. It shall be to them a renown in the day that I shall be glorified. It will result in a new Jewish holiday. And for the scattered bodies, in verses 14 and 15, describes the search for these different bodies. In verse 14, we see the search. They shall set apart men of continual employment. They shall pass through the land. So people will be hired for the specific purpose of passing through the land in order to find hidden bodies not so visible. And with them that pass through, those that bury them, they'll remain upon the face of the land. So following the scouts who find these bodies, they'll put up a marker that will help someone see, the ones in charge of actual burial, to see what the markers are. And when they go to the marker, they'll find the body, and then the body found will be quickly buried. And the purpose is to cleanse the land. So after 7 months, the land will be cleansed. And in verse 15, it describes the procedure. First step, they that pass through the land shall pass through. These will be the scouts. Second step, when any sees a man's bones, then shall he set up a sign by it, a visible marker. Third step, till the buriers have buried in it in the valley of Hamon Gog. And on the mountain overlooking the burial place will be a new city in verse 16. And Hamonah shall also be the name of a city. Again, Hamonah means the multitude. A new Jewish city will be built, perhaps overlooking the valley of burial, will put this city in occupied territory, and the result is that in this manner they shall cleanse the land. Now let's talk about Roman numeral 2, the timing of the invasion, calculate some basic observations. Number one, this takes place after Israel has become a state. So it could not have been fulfilled before 1948. Secondly, when Jews are regathered out of many nations, that's from 1948 onward. Thirdly, when the waste places in many countries are inhabited again, and this will ever since, it continues the process of rebuilding old cities, of building new ones. Fourthly, Israel is dwelling in unwalled villages, present-day kibbutzim and moshavim. Fifthly, Israel is dwelling securely, again, not in peace, but in confidence. So all the descriptions of Israel in this text are true of present-day Israel. So now we need to deal with the different timings. I'm not going to go to the details, you'll find it in the First Steps book, but one view is they'll happen in the middle of the tribulation. Now keep in mind, what you have to deal with is the 7 months of burial and the 7 years of burning. You have to fit those in. And often people take a specific position but ignore that problem of the 7 months of burial and 7 years of burning. So as far as the Mitra view, I won't give you all the reasons, but I'll focus on those two issues, 7 months and 7 years. Now we know that in the middle of the tribulation, the Jews are fleeing the land. It's something described in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 22, Matthew 24, verses 15 to 22. And they're fleeing the land because the Antichrist has invaded the land and so on. And so they have no time for 7 months of burial. They're fleeing. And furthermore, the 7 years will cover the whole second half of the tribulation and 3.5 years into the Messianic kingdom. And that is an impossibility, because Isaiah 65, the last 10 verses or so, verses 17 to the end, he points out that in the kingdom he will renovate the earth supernaturally, and there won't be any need to worry about 7 years of burning or 7 months of burial. Go to your second page. Then we come to the post-tribulation view, and they connect Gog and Magog with the campaign of Armageddon. The difference is, for example, that only some nations invade Israel, but in Armageddon, all nations invade Israel. But the main problem is, if it's after tribulation, that means for the first 7 months of burial in the kingdom, the first 7 months of the kingdom will be burying dead bodies. But that is not allowed by the supernatural renovation of the earth for the kingdom. Furthermore, it'll take 7 years of burning the equipment, the first 7 years of the 1,000-year kingdom, and there's simply no time for that either. The supernatural renovation of Isaiah 65, verse 17 to the end, would not allow for that. Then the capital D interlude period, that is found in Daniel chapter 12, verses 11 through 13. Daniel 12, 11 through 13. It spells out how many days will transpire between the end of the tribulation with the second coming of the Messiah and the start of the kingdom. And it's only 75 days old. That's all. Only 75 days old. And the 7 months of burial is 210 days old. 210 days old. And so the interlude time doesn't give you 210 days. It certainly doesn't give you 7 years of burning. So the interlude, let many things happen in the interlude to get the world ready for the kingdom. But this it won't be the 7 years of burning and 7 months of burial. You have the post-millennial view. At the end of the millennium, it describes a Gog and Magog war. Let's just turn briefly to Revelation chapter 20. In verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are finished, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall come forth to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to the world, number of whom is the sand of the sea. And they went up over the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down out of heaven and devoured them. Now, it mentions Gog and Magog, but this is merely becoming an idiom because of Ezekiel 37 and 38 and 39. Because as we noted, we're dealing with a situation where only certain nations come together to invade Israel. But here, when Satan is released from his 1,000-year imprisonment, he'll continue his work of deception. He'll deceive people from all the nations around the world. There'll be a worldwide situation, not a localized situation of the Middle East. And therefore, it's a similarity that happens when someone using the phrase, he met his Waterloo. Now, if you know some history about Europe, that's when the leader of France, he was able to defeat one army after the other, but in Waterloo, his army was defeated. And so that became an idiom. Somebody's rising in power, but suddenly collapses, so we could say he met his Waterloo. And that's the situation here. It's just an idiom resulting from what happened in chapters 37 and 38. And so there will be such an invasion. It's not the same invasion as the Ezekiel invasion. And furthermore, this one, once the land entered the land of Israel, they're destroyed by fire out of heaven very quickly. And there's nothing to keep them. So the best option, going back to the last thing on page 2 of your outline, the pre-tribulational view, because it has to happen at least a certain amount of time before the tribulation starts. Because you have to deal with the 7 months and 7 years. It has to happen minimally 3.5 years before the tribulation starts. Now, it can come many years before that, maybe 20, 30 years before that, but it can happen no later than 3.5 years before the tribulation starts. Then you have no problem with the 7 months of burial, and no problem with the 7 years of burning. And so that's the best place to fit this particular invasion. So if you have a footsteps, you can look at a copy on the book table. There is a chart showing basically the tribulation events, pre-trib and tribulation events. And you'll notice there are 9 events that will lead up to the tribulation. And one of these is the Gog and Magog war. So 3 have happened, and this one will be the next major prophetic event to be fulfilled. One more thing I should make clear is that the rapture is not dependent upon any of this. The rapture can come at any time, even today. But the rapture is something we'll discuss tomorrow, I believe, the topic. So you get all the details tomorrow. Again, I'm not saying the rapture will come tomorrow. We're going to study what the rapture is tomorrow. Okay? All right. Our time is up. We have time for questions. All right. If you have a question, raise your hand. Okay.
I have a question in your footsteps book. In the conversation about Ezekiel 38 and 39, you mentioned throughout human history there has been this balance of power between the East and the West. And this supernatural event of God intervening and stopping this invasion is what totally disrupted that balance of power of East and West. Can you go into that?
Well, since the Roman Empire got divided you've had this East-West balance of power. Then the West Roman Empire was still based in Rome, but the East Roman Empire was based in Constantinople. Today it is Istanbul, but it was Constantinople before. And then in the 1400s, when the Turks invaded the Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire collapsed, and the leaders moved northward into Russia, infiltrated the Russian government, and the main power is still with Russia and the Eastern balance of power. There may be some more movement as time goes on, we don't know, but there'll still be an Eastern and the Western in the West. The West Roman Empire fell. It was taken over by Charlemagne of the Franks, or French, and it was then called the Roman Empire of the Frankish nation. After a century and a half, it was taken over by the Germans, and the German king called himself Tsar, which is the German name for Caesar, and it became known as the West Roman Empire of the German nation. And later on, it moved into the Western democracies. So the balance of power still is, since those days, the Western balance of power and Eastern balance of power. But something has to crack, and the destruction of Russia and all those nations will destroy the Eastern balance of power, and that will lead to the one world government in preparation for certain events that will lead up to the tribulation. Question?
I have a question. You talk about, in Ezekiel 38, towards the end, you talk about this monstrous earthquake that's going to occur. And it says, the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, and all the men who are on the face of the earth will shake at my presence. And so, I mean, it looks like, is it going to be a spiritual? It's going to be an actual earthquake, I understand. But for the whole involvement of the earth to be
well, the Hebrew word it's not the Hebrew word for world. It's the Hebrew word adamah for land. So the earthquake only affects the land with the invasion.
But how do the people on the face of the earth recognize that? Is it like a spiritual shaking, or what?
No, it's a very physical shaking, not spiritual shaking. It's very physical shaking.
Will the whole world feel it?
Well, many parts of the world will feel it, but the whole world feel it, that doesn't matter. The whole world will know from news media and so on what happened in the land.
So the whole world will know.
They'll know,
right.
but they won't, the whole world won't necessarily feel the shaking.
Okay, I understand.
Any question?
Yeah, Arnold, the scripture says that this invasion will come against the kingdom of unwalled villages, unwalled cities. Some people object to that and say, well, Israel has all these walls at this point.
Well, they don't have walls. They have security fences and so on. But the word chomah means a solid wall, which you cannot squeeze in into. Only two cities can maintain the solid wall: Jerusalem and Akko. But the kibbutzim have a fencing. The moshavim have a fencing. They're not actually solid walls, which is what the Hebrew word requires. Question? Okay.
I know this is a little bit out of, I shouldn't say this, but because you said that the spoil can't be mentioned. Is it possible? Is it possible that all those gas fields could be included as part of that?
It's possible, but we don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that a possibility? Yes.
Yeah.
Will it be? I don't know. Yeah. Okay, back there.
So you're talking in Ezekiel 39, or not, 39:7, where God makes himself known and there's a revival. And so how does that work its way out, depending on when this occurs, for the restoration of Israel? They call out to him. This is a revelation by God sovereignly. I'm trying to, what the effect of this knowledge and salvation event means long term.
Well, long term, we don't know, because it's so long. What we know is that after all of the miracles in Egypt, 10 plagues, they crossed the other side of the ocean, the Red Sea and so on. Look how fast, within 3 months, they started rebelling and so on. So So falling that fast is not that unusual, especially in the Jewish world. I mean, I never told you the story last time I was here, but there's a story that connects with this, that when the Jews began leaving Egypt, that they, let me step back, there was a Jewish family that moved into a new neighborhood, and their next door neighbors turned out to be a Baptist family. And they both had sons the same age. So they became friends, and one day the Baptist son asked the Jewish son that could he go with him to the Sunday school class. The Jewish son asked the parents, and the parents were very secular Jewish people. They didn't do much anything religiously or so on. They were typical American Jewish families. And so they were a bit nervous about this, but so they decided not to make an issue and told the son, you can go there one time. When you come back, just tell us what they taught you in case we need to give you a different perspective. The two boys went. When they came back to their homes, the Jewish son was confronted by the parents, and the parents asked him, what did they teach you in that Baptist school? And the son says, oh, they taught us all about Moses. The parents were a bit surprised. Really? They taught about Moses? Yes, they did. But what did they say about Moses? What they said was that when Moses came to the Red Sea, the Jewish family began chasing them. So Moses built a pontoon bridge over the Red Sea, and the Jews ran across the pontoon bridge. And the Egyptian army tried to follow them. Moses called for an airstrike, and the airstrike destroyed the bridge. The Jews were saved. And the parents asked the son, is that what they taught you at that Baptist school? The son says, well, that's not the way they put it. If I told you what they really said, you'd never believe it. Christy Martin, Jewish seen quite well. Question? We done?
Thank you.
You tell me, are we done?